Hey guys, and welcome back to another Python video. Now, in today's video, we're going to learn one of the most fundamental concepts in programming, known as functions. And especially today, we're going to learn how to create and use our own functions in Python. Now, setting that aside, let's get on with the lesson, shall we? So, up until this moment right now, we've actually been used to functions before, such as the print function that prints our output to the user, and the range function to create a list of integers to a specific range. And all of these are examples of functions, but these are pre-built functions into Python. So Python recognizes it and uses it. So you actually don't see the code for these functions. But we can actually create our own functions in Python, which is known as user-defined functions. Okay? So let's actually do that. In order to create a function in Python, you first have to start off with the keyword def. And def stands for define. So you actually have to define your function and say what code is inside it before you can use it in your program. Now, after writing def, you then have to add the name for your function. So in this case, since we're just starting off with the basics, we can just call this my function. Okay? So after adding the brackets, we can just end off our function by adding a colon. Now the fun begins because we're actually going to add code to our function. So let's actually start off with something very simple, a print statement. So let's say this is my function. Now, let's see if I run my code and let's see what we get. Okay, so I ran my code and I got nothing. Why? Because functions, you can't just run a function by defining it. No. Think of it like this. This is the actual instructions for your function. So in order to use your function in your program, you have to call your function. And to call your function, you have to call the name of your function. Just the name. You don't have to include the keyword def. Okay? So to use my function, I call my function, and the brackets will be included, and then I just run my program. There we go. It says this is my function. So I know my function works. Now let's make our function much more complex and advanced by actually adding a mathematical operation. So let's take this out of the way and take this out of the way as well. So in our original function, our function accepted no inputs, no variables. But now it's actually going to accept an input. And it's going to accept a variable x. So when we add any variables inside these brackets, these are known as function attributes, okay? So the attributes of functions are basically the function's variables, okay? So when I need to call this function, I need to add a value inside the brackets which represents the value for x, which the function can then use to execute its goal or function, okay? So just think of it like that. So let's say our function needs to add the value of 7 to any number that is inside the brackets. So any number for x. So let's say y equals x plus 7, okay? And then let's actually do print y. So this time when I call my function, I need to add a value inside the brackets. Otherwise, I will get a Python error. So let me add 5 inside the brackets. And let's run our program. Okay, 5 plus 7, we get 12. So that's correct. And this can be done multiple times. So I can just copy and paste this. Oh, copy and paste this. And then we can change it to 9. And then we can change it to -3. Run the program again. Same result, okay? So just remember to add a value inside the brackets. Now, this is a very basic structure for functions, okay? It can be much more complex and much more efficient and cleaner. Now, instead of printing this, let's actually do something else, okay? Let's do return y, okay? And I'll explain to you what return y means. So then I have to do print my function 5. Let's run our program. There, I got 12. Now you might be wondering, what does return mean? Well, return, it returns the value of y back into the program, okay? So you might be wondering, why do we do this? Well, in functions, just generally, the goal of a function is to do a specific instruction and then return its value back into the program, because we actually need that value, because we don't need to always call our function to just get that single value. So in order to use that value multiple times in our program, we need to use the return statement. So that's what the return statement is. But when we return it, it's not like the print statement, okay? We're not actually printing the value of y. We're just returning it to our program so we can use it anywhere else. So that's why in this case, I need to print my function 5, because what this function does is that it takes in the value of 5, it adds 7 to it, it puts that value to the variable y, and then it returns y. But once it returns y, it's just an integer, okay? But then I print that integer, the value of y, onto my screen. And that's how I got 12, okay? So if you need to use the return statement in any of your functions, make sure to add a print statement as well, okay? Now let's move on to a more advanced example of functions. So we're actually going to create a function to solve the volume of a rectangle. So let's actually do that, shall we? So we define our function, and let's call this rec underscore volume. Okay, so the formula for the volume of a rectangle is length times width times height of the rectangle. So we need actually 3 variables or 3 attributes in our function. And let's call this L, W, and H, representing length, width, and height. Now, after doing that, let's create the variable volume. And that is equal to length times width times height, okay? Now, instead of printing our volume, we're actually going to return our volume, okay? So return volume. Now, that's our function, but we actually need our program to allow our user to input the length and width and height of a rectangle. So let's do length equals integer input and a prompt for the user. So please enter the length of the rectangle. Width, we can actually copy and paste this. We have one for width. Please enter the width of your rectangle. And then we have height. So height okay, so that's just 3 simple input statements. Now, after doing that, we actually need to call our function. So we call rec volume, and we need to assign the variables to the attributes, okay? So for length, we add the variable length. For width, we add the variable width. And for height, we add the variable height, okay? So I just want to explain it. What our rec volume function does is that whatever integer or value that the user enters for each of these 3 variables, it assigns that value to the attribute L in our function. So let's say the user enters length of 3. The function actually takes that value and assigns the value of 3 to the attribute L. And the same goes for width and height, okay? So it's just assigning the value of whatever the user enters to the attributes in the function. So we're not actually done. We need to actually print our volume. So let's actually do that. So print, let's actually add some strings. So the volume of the rectangle, rectangle, is, comma, this answer right here. So let's actually see if our program works, shall we? So we run our program. Let's say we have a length of 5, width of 6, and height of 3. Okay, so the volume of our rectangle is 90 cubic units, whatever units you want to decide to use. Okay, so now let's move on to a second example where we get the sum of a list of integers entered by the user. So to do this, we actually create a function for this. So def, and let's call it sum of list. Okay? And for our variables, our attributes, let's call this integers. Okay? But keep in mind, this is going to be a list. Okay, now before actually creating a for loop to sum up our list, we're actually going to create a variable called total. And this is going to store the sum of all the integers inside our list. Okay? So, after doing that, we can actually initiate our for loop. So, for I in integers, remember this is a list, we can actually replace I with numbers, keep it more specific, and then we can do total plus equal numbers. Okay? So for all the numbers inside this list of integers, it adds that value to total. And it keeps adding until it reaches the end of that list, okay? So plus equal, as you heard in the loops lesson, is basically total equals total plus numbers, okay? That's basically what plus equal is. So plus equal numbers. Now, after doing that, we do return. Oh, return the value of total, okay? So that's our function. Now, the only thing we have to do now is call our function. So before calling our function, we need to actually ask our user to enter a list. So let's call this list of num. Okay, so after creating list of num, an empty list, we're actually going to make our user enter a list of numbers. Now, by default, you can't actually make the user input a list in Python. So what we're going to do is that we're going to make the user input individual numbers and then add it to our list, okay? But it's going to be much more easier than like step-by-step process, okay? There's not going to be any repetition because we're going to use a for loop. So for I, and let's say we want the user to enter 5 numbers, okay? So for I in range 5, num equals integer input, and then we ask the user, please enter a number. And then what we do after that is we call our list dot append. So we actually add the numbers into our list for every time the loop runs. And we have to put num in here. And then there we go. Okay? That's our for loop. Now we're not done. The final step is to actually use this list in our function. So let's call our function sum of list, and then let's put list of num as the attribute, okay? And then we do a print statement to actually get our answer. Let's actually add a string as well, shall we? So the sum of the list is, comma, there we go. Okay, now let's see if our code actually runs. Okay, so please enter a number. Let me say, let's keep it simple. So let's just keep it all 3s. So actually, let's keep it all 4s. So 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. Okay? There we go. The sum of my list is 20. Okay? Because 4 times 5 is 20. So we know our list works, our for loop works, and definitely our function works as well. Okay guys, that's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with anyone who's interested in coding with Python. Now, until the next video, This is a bye from Ashwin's Tech Talks. See ya, guys.